Good morning. I'm Jay Conger, and I'm a senior research scientist at the Center for Effective Organizations at the Marshall School, and also I'm the Henry Kravis Professor of Leadership Studies at Claremont McKenna. I'm going to spend the next half hour with you talking about something very relevant to you as a leader and its impact on how you lead well the individuals that you have to shape their decisions and influence their behaviors. It's a very simple concept, but very, very powerful. It's called leveraging the spotlight on your leadership. You and I, as leaders, anyone actually in a leadership role, sit in a natural spotlight. And basically, it's a point where the followers, or the team, or the associates who follow us, scrutinize our actions and ponder what we're really saying, and they make sense out of, in some ways, some of the smallest things you can imagine. I always like to say your musings at a meeting this afternoon will be somebody's dinner time later tonight. That spotlight is very intense, it's very powerful, and many executives and managers allow it to be a headlight rather than a spotlight. And I can tell you from lots of experience working with managers and executives, you do not want the headlight, you want the spotlight. Let me explain why you're in that spotlight, and let me show you its power. Last year, you'll remember the three American car executives, the three CEOs, came to Washington, D.C. to testify about their needs in the crisis that we're going through. This was a rather lengthy testimony, but what got all the attention was not actually what they said, but how they arrived in Washington, D.C. to testify. And the scuttlebutt and the big story, of course, was the arrival in corporate jets. This was a powerful example of the spotlight of leadership. The Congress and the citizens preferred to make more meat, shall we say, out of their transportation means than out of the content of what they had to say. In this case, the private jets were used as a means to undermine the testimony of these executives. That is the intensity of that spotlight. In many ways, you can think about your associates, the people who work for you, as almost like kids with a magnifying glass. And you'll remember when you got your first magnifying glass, you spent a few minutes indoors, maybe exaggerating newspapers or cartoon books, but pretty quickly you headed outside. And what you did with your magnifying glass is something that wasn't such a pretty picture. You began torching certain creatures in the animal kingdom and setting fire to leaves and newspapers and whatever else. You use that intensity to do things that were kind of destructive. Well, in some ways, your associates are provided with that same magnifying glass. They're scrutinizing your words and your actions to determine what you actually stand for. They're also using it in a positive way as a model. They're trying to learn from you and then incorporate that learning in their own actions. They're also trying to figure out, well, what are the most important priorities and goals that you have as a leader? And they're trying to embody those in their own actions. But they're also using the spotlight to test your credibility. They want to see do your deeds actually match your words, or are they inconsistent? They want to see how human you are, or whether you're so egotistical that they should begin using that magnifying glass to begin searching for the flaws. Some of them are competitive, and they'd like to know that they're just as good as you are. That's why you're in a spotlight. And what I'm going to talk about in the next 25 minutes is how you can leverage that attention rather than actually be harmed by it. In other words, how you can use it as a way to shape and influence the behaviors and actions and decisions of the people who work for you. It's a powerful tool, so make it a spotlight, not a headlight. Basically, there are three ways that you and I can leverage that attention. I call them the M&Ms. And I'm using the M&Ms in the hopes that you'll remember this message because, like you, I right now sit in the spotlight and I'm garnering your attention and you're scrutinizing what I have to say. And if I'm going to successfully lead you to my point of view, I have to use the very same tools that leaders use in that spotlight of leadership. The three tools are memorable stories, memorable examples, and we tell these so that we get recall. It's very important you have the attention of your team, and you want to leverage that in a powerful way so they remember the messages, the goals, the values, the behaviors, and the priorities that you set for them. The irony, as we'll see in a minute, is that the brain is not a very memorable organ. It has a hard time remembering things, and particularly in a world of information overload. The second M that we'll talk about basically are called must-dos, which are simple sound bites that you and I shape to guide the performance priorities of our team. You can think about our team just like ourselves, swimming in priorities. Hard to figure out which one is more important, and sometimes putting more of our energy on a lower important priority than actually the more critical priorities. What a must-do, it is a simple soundbite that you as a leader use at meetings to drive home the absolute critical performance priorities for the group. So they move their attention from the lower priorities to the significant ones. And the third dimension, the third M, has to do with modeling, that in many ways you and I as leaders are like parents. The kids, our associates, the team, scrutinize our actions to determine what they should be doing. What are the priorities in terms of actions and decisions? You can use your own modeling as one of the most powerful ways to shape behavior in that spotlight of leadership. But let's start with our first one, memorable stories. We know from research on the brain, on memory, that actually you might call our minds mental misers. In other words, we choose not to store much information. On the one hand, it would seem that the brain is a pretty vast place. You could put a lot in there. It's like a giant walk-in closet of sorts. But in reality, the brain is very, very efficiency-minded. And most of the day is spent actually pushing a delete key. Delete, delete, delete. Our dilemma as leaders is captivating enough attention in the moment and then allowing our messages to stick into the minds of the people we're leading. It's a serious problem, though, because the way the brain is constructed, it goes through memory cycles throughout a day. Most of the memory is built around 15 to 20-minute cycles, which are called short-term memory. And in that period, the brain can only hold roughly 3 to 5 pieces of information. At the end of that cycle of 15 to 20 minutes, the brain gets tired. It goes into a short fatigue cycle of approximately 2 minutes. During that 2-minute fatigue cycle, it is basically not registering whatever you're saying as the leader. In addition, it is slowly erasing a few of those things that are being held in short-term memory. And that's the day, all these cycles of short-term memory. And now the big wall arrives, nighttime. You crawl into bed, you pull up those covers, and your brain then actually begins a lengthy process of erasing most of what's been stored during the day. Whatever makes it to morning is now in long-term memory, but it's actually very little that makes it to morning. You and I as leaders have a fundamental dilemma then. While we have the attention of our team, they may not actually be able to recall much of what we share with them. So how do we make things stick? Well, we know from research on words that words are the weakest medium. As a matter of fact, now that we're 6 or 7 minutes into the presentation, you've already forgotten some of the earlier words I shared. We also know that statistics are extremely weak. Studies where people were exposed to just 15 minutes of numbers and 24 hours later asked to recall that list of statistics, they can only remember 5 to 10% of the statistics. It's not looking pretty good. You can imagine sitting on your desk are piles of PowerPoints. These too are extremely weak for recall. You and I have to turn to the oldest medium for memory, which are stories. Now, these aren't stories that you tell your children, and these may or may not be the stories that friends tell you about an encounter or a funny event that happened to them. These are stories that you find in your work experience, and you share these with your colleagues. And in each of the stories are priorities or values or behaviors or goals that you want the team to remember. So Fred Smith, the founder of Federal Express, has for many years shared at many of the company meetings stories of delivery men and women who have gone beyond the norm to serve the customer, but also to get the package or the goods absolutely, positively overnight. What Fred realizes is in those stories is a higher probability that the thousands of associates of Federal Express will remember the core message. Herb Kelleher, the founder of Southwest Airlines, often traveled around the U.S. telling a very simple story about why Southwest tickets were priced so low. He would talk about competitors who had priced their tickets at $79 and $89 for one flight. And he'd talk about angry shareholders writing in and saying, well, why don't you have the decency just to price your tickets at $10 below that, $69 or $79? Why $39? And he would tell the story of writing back to these shareholders and explaining that $39 was the price of driving the car from one destination to the other, and that the competition for Southwest Airlines wasn't really other airlines, it was automobiles. These two leaders, through their simple stories, drove home the critical points and messages that they wanted their organizations to remember. One was a strategic message, and the other was about core values and performance. So in your day, look around. There are events, positive events and negative events that become the raw material for simple 1 to 2 minute stories you can tell to your team to illustrate the real priorities or the core values. Stories make your message memorable. Remember that most of the other means you and I use in a day, words, PowerPoint, statistics, are completely forgettable. Let's go to number 2, which is basically this idea of must-dos. In any organization, if you're like I am, you're swimming in priorities. And many of them are low priorities, and a few of them are high priorities. And often it's more seductive, actually, to focus on the low priorities, because sometimes they're easier to accomplish. But what great leaders do is they help us understand, in that spotlight of leadership, what the real absolute priorities are. And they put these priorities in simple sound bites, which I call must-dos. In other words, we have to all be focused on these. In my world as a professor, I'm guided by one of them, very powerful. It's called publish or perish. And personally, I'd much rather publish than perish. It's a lovely little saying, a lovely must-do. It's simple, it's memorable, and it's very clear about the consequences. The best leaders take their priorities and they turn them into these kinds of simple but powerful statements. Now, none of them are trite. So in many organizations, we see these kind of very trite, like let's be one company or teamwork for all. No. A good must-do is meaty and it often has consequences. I'm going to show you a few examples so you'll see what I mean by a powerful must-do. This is an example, for example, of a how-to. Bring me the bad news early and personally. This is from Ron Williams, the CEO of Aetna, who loves to get the bad news so that he and the team can address it. And having worked with Ron for a number of years, he would open each meeting with his team by saying this must-do. Please bring me the bad news personally and early. And to make the must-do stick, Ron rewarded those individuals who did exactly that. The second must-do, which is a lovely illustration of what I'll call a priority for the organization, is you're about to lose every second customer. This was told to me by a man named Werner Peyer, who's a Swiss banker, and he basically, in the wealth management section that he runs of Switzerland, he tells the story of basically looking in the files of a man who is a client. And his description as an occupation was gardener. Well, he called the gardener and had him to lunch and discovered that he was the most famous landscape architect in all of Switzerland. He liked to tell this story because he realized that about every other customer, the wealth management advisors didn't fully understand or appreciate. Very, very important, setting this sense of priorities and boundaries. Other must-dos are timing must-dos and boundary must-dos, and I've illustrated a couple examples for you. Some of them are quite famous, like Federal Express, absolutely, positively, overnight. Clear, powerful must-dos. Some are as simple as the Ritz-Carlton, answer the phone by the third ring with a smile. Toyota has a famous one, a single defect destroys the relationship. As you can see in all these examples, they're to the point, usually have a strong visual and emotional connection, and lay out often the consequences. So pick your top 3 or 4 priorities, 5 priorities for your team, and craft them into these memorable must-dos that you tell and retell at the start and end of every meeting to drive home the priorities. Human beings have a difficult time in getting a sense of what the real priorities are. and they're often distracted by the smaller and easier to achieve priorities. Help your team with that, shape their behavior. Make certain the must-dos are the to-dos. The third dimension that I'm going to talk about has to do with your modeling. Modeling is actually something, again, that many of you who are parents know its power. It's often fascinating to watch how your children will start imitating you. And you realize it's largely based on their observations. Like a leader, you sit in a spotlight and they figure out what's right and what's wrong, and pretty quickly they start to mimic you and eventually internalize that behavior. The best leaders are consciously modeling what is important for their team to do and adapt. One example of this is certainly Richard Branson, who in his actions, in his playfulness, in his routines, in his antics, models very powerfully unconventionality, a spirit of adventure, youthfulness, and being out of the box. If you think about it, those are the very qualities that the Virgin Group of companies are renowned for. In addition, if you think about underneath all of that is a theme of entertainment, which is often what the core of many of these services and products of the Virgin Group. I was on a Virgin America flight the other day, and I was asking the purser if he'd had Richard Branson on his flight. And he said, "Oh, yeah, I've had him a couple times." So out of curiosity, I said, "Well, where does he sit?" And he said, "Well, he always sits here in the back in coach." And I said, "Really? He doesn't sit on a first-class seat?" And he said, No. Richard knows how much those seats go for. He knows what the revenue stream is up front." Now, let me contrast that modeling with the CEOs of many of the other major American airlines. Whenever I'm on a flight with a large American carrier, I usually ask, "Where does your CEO sit?" Not so surprisingly, the response is in first class. And then if you ask what they're usually doing during the flight, you'll hear that often they're working. Richard Branson was modeling that ultimately this is a business, the seats at the front are more valuable, and therefore they should go to the high-paying customers. I also asked if Richard gets to choose his seat, and I was told he takes whatever is available. Herb Kelleher, who I mentioned earlier at Southwest Airlines, to this day, even though he's retired, makes a point of getting on every flight that he flies on at Southwest and going and literally serving drinks or peanuts during the entire flight. He's modeling that while we can't offer you a lot in that cabin, we can offer you good, warm service. What's also interesting about Herb is when he boards a flight, he goes to the purser and asks him or her what station he should take. Because after all, on that plane, the purser is the boss. So Herb very cleverly acknowledges the hierarchy, but also acknowledges the core values of service and friendliness to his clients. So I'd ask you, what do you need to be modeling more of? How could you leverage the attention you're getting in a more constructive way to drive home perhaps a core value or a priority or something around performance that you feel is particularly important? Find that behavior and make certain you're able to do it consistently and visibly. And by the way, it's hard to model on email. So you got to get out and touch your organization and the associates and be there in person. So let me close by saying that you and I sit in this natural spotlight. It's there whether we like it or not. As we go up the hierarchy, its intensity increases. And it has lots of strange qualities. People like to exaggerate things they hear. They like to pick selectively what they see. But that attention is very, very powerful. And all leaders who are exceptional leaders throughout history have leveraged that attention to shape the decisions of the people that work for them and shape the actions and priorities that their teams embrace. So hopefully you too will see the power of the spotlight. And remember, stay in the spotlight. Don't make it a headlight. And now I think we have time for questions.
Yes, we have one question here. I feel like I'm in the spotlight in my role. How do I better my sense of self-awareness?
So the question is, I feel like I'm in the spotlight in my role. How do I better my sense of self-awareness? One of the best things you can do is turn to a confidant. Find one or two of your team who you feel can give you an honest perspective on what you're doing in the spotlight, who can give you some feedback. get their reactions, get their suggestions. If that's difficult for you to do with a subordinate, you might see if a superior or a peer would be willing to do that for you as well. You might have a colleague who would be happy to come and sit in on a couple meetings and watch you and watch the reactions of your team and give you some feedback. I often find it's more valuable to find others who know you fairly well to give you that kind of feedback and tell them that please, don't be polite, don't be nice, tell it to me like you actually see it.
Here's another question. My staff members seem to remember only the bad things and not the good things that I do. Any suggestions on how this memory recall can be altered?
So the question is, my staff seem to remember more of the bad things than the good things. And how can I ultimately shift that perception? Well, what we know is that when you have been tagged in this way with more negative attributes, it will take you a while to break that stereotype. In other words, stereotypes are fairly enduring. What you're going to have to do is very, very conscientiously, in visible settings, for example, meetings or conferences, practice a few behaviors that are quite the opposite of what has gotten you that negative attribution. Practice them very consistently. Don't say anything. Just be visible, do the actions. It will take a few months, but if you are able to be extremely consistent, people will begin to say, you know, I've noticed something a bit different about him or her. But give yourself time, and you have to do this with consistency. It's a bit like trying to lose weight. If you lose 5 pounds this week, but you put it on next week, and you give up the third week, the negative attribution will stick. The other thing you might do is ask yourself, well, what are 1 or 2 behaviors that my associates would see as very, very positive behaviors that I could relatively easily implement, and choose those. And I always like to say, don't choose more than 1 or 2 behaviors at a time. You and I are too busy to focus on more than that. And really, really just focus on those, be consistent, figure out a way to chart yourself. The other thing you can do, which is very powerful, is ask for your team to give you feedback. To say, I'm working on this new behavior or this kind of new activity, and I'd love your feedback. That will stick in their mind that you are working on something, but you have to consistently demonstrate it. If you give up, they will go back to their cynical views.
As a manager of a virtual team, what tactics can be used for modeling?
Great question. As a manager of a virtual team, what tactics can be used for modeling? Well, when you're leading a virtual team, one of the ways you can model is literally by the sound of your voice, and also what you focus on in your phone conversations when you do hold teleconferences. Email, it's very difficult to model other than the fact often the opening sentence or opening sentences may model for the team your priorities. So if you keep driving home your priorities, and you can actually embed in an email your must-dos. So you could literally remind everybody, here's our core must-do. But what we do know in research on virtual teams and leading virtual teams is that the best place to leverage the spotlight is in those few meetings where everybody actually gets together. And using those very cleverly and powerfully, particularly at the start of any projects, that's the window to do the modeling and the leveraging of the spotlight. But again, if you're using phone conferences, the tone of your voice, your sense of priorities, your sense of humor, what you talk about are other vehicles. Weaker, but there are other ways to do that. Great. Well, thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this half hour, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the Marshall School Executive Education Programs.